has seen historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
When wildlife officials in Florida announced they were turning loose thousands of snakes into a state already overrun with snakes, the internet did what the internet always does. It laughed. Comment sections filled up with jokes about a state so used to strange headlines that this one barely raised an eyebrow. Late-night hosts made it a punchline. Even some biologists admitted the plan sounded, on paper, like the setup to a disaster movie. But strip away the mockery and you find something else entirely. A slow-motion ecological collapse so severe that scientists had run out of conventional options, and a predator so specialized that it might be the only creature on Earth built to answer it. This is the story of how a joke became one of the most quietly remarkable comeback stories in modern conservation. To understand why Florida would ever consider adding more snakes to its swamps, you first have to understand what had already been lost. The Everglades is not just a swamp. It is one of the largest subtropical wilderness systems left on the planet, a slow-moving river of grass stretching from the middle of the state down to the tip of the peninsula. For thousands of years it functioned as a single interconnected organism, water flowing south, feeding sawgrass prairies, cypress domes, and mangrove estuaries, each zone supporting a web of life so dense that early explorers described clouds of birds blotting out the sun. That richness came with an economic price tag most people never think about. Modern estimates place the value of the services the Everglades provides: drinking water for millions of South Floridians, flood control, fisheries, tourism, in the tens of billions of dollars annually. It is not an exaggeration to say that the health of this one ecosystem underpins the livelihood of an entire region. So when biologists doing routine surveys in the early 2000s started noticing that fewer animals were showing up in traps, fewer tracks were appearing in the mud, and fewer eyes reflected back in the beam of a spotlight at night, it raised alarm. At first, the drop in sightings was written off as normal fluctuation. Wildlife populations rise and fall. But the decline did not stop. It got worse, year after year, until it became impossible to explain away as coincidence. By the time researchers ran controlled surveys comparing animal populations inside the python's range to areas outside it, the numbers were staggering. Raccoon sightings had collapsed by well over 90%. Possums had all but disappeared from large stretches of habitat. Bobcat numbers were down by more than 80%, and white-tailed deer, once common enough to be a driving hazard on rural roads, had become a rare sight. Marsh rabbits, a species so common they were practically background noise in the ecosystem, vanished from entire survey zones. Something had turned one of the richest wildlife nurseries in North America into an eerie, half-empty stage. The culprit did not arrive with fanfare. There was no single dramatic event that unleashed it, though a direct hit from a hurricane in the early 1990s that destroyed a reptile facility likely played a role in accelerating things. What really built the problem over decades was simpler and sadder: the exotic pet trade. Burmese pythons, native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, were imported by the thousands as pets. They were sold small and cute, and grew, sometimes reaching lengths of well over 15 feet and weights over 200 pounds. Owners who had no way to house an animal that size did what desperate pet owners have done throughout history. They let it go, assuming the wild would either absorb it or it would simply die. It did not die. South Florida's climate is a near-perfect match for the python's native range: warm, humid, full of water, and stocked with an endless buffet of prey that had never evolved any defense against an ambush predator this size. With no natural enemies waiting for them, the pythons did not just survive. They thrived spectacularly. A single female can lay somewhere close to 100 eggs in a clutch, and unlike many reptiles, python mothers will guard and even help regulate the temperature of their nests, boosting hatchling survival rates far beyond what scientists typically see in snakes. Estimates on the current population vary wildly, from tens of thousands to several 100,000 animals spread across the southern half of the state, and that uncertainty is itself part of the horror story. Pythons are ambush predators, built to lie motionless in dense vegetation for hours or days at a time. Their patterned scales are almost perfectly camouflaged against the mottled light and shadow of sawgrass and cypress knees. Even trained researchers using radio telemetry to track tagged snakes have walked within a few feet of a python without seeing it. For every snake captured, an unknown number remain completely invisible to human eyes, breeding quietly, waiting, growing. Florida did not sit on its hands. Over the past 2 decades, the state and federal government have poured extraordinary resources into trying to control the python population, and the range of tactics attempted reads like something out of a military campaign rather than a wildlife management plan. Professional hunting contracts were established, paying trained removal agents by the hour to patrol canals and levees at night, when pythons are most active. Public hunting competitions were launched, drawing hundreds of participants from across the country armed with hooks, bags, and headlamps, competing for cash prizes and bragging rights. These events generated enormous publicity and did remove real numbers of snakes from a landscape, but even a banner year of competition captures only a few hundred animals against a population that may number in the hundreds of thousands. Beyond boots-on-the-ground hunting, researchers experimented with genuinely inventive technology. Detector dogs, trained specifically to key in on python scent, were deployed to sniff out snakes hidden deep in brush that a human eye would penetrate. Thermal imaging drones scanned wetlands from above, hoping to catch the heat signature of a basking python against the cooler background of mud and water. Perhaps most cleverly, biologists began using what are known as sentinel or Judas snakes, male pythons fitted with radio transmitters and released back into the wild during breeding season. Because male pythons instinctively seek out females by scent during mating season, tracking one often leads researchers straight to a large, egg-laden female who would otherwise never have been found. This single technique has led to the removal of some of the largest individual pythons ever recorded in the state. And still, despite dogs, drones, sentinel snakes, contract hunters, and public competitions, the honest assessment from scientists working the problem has remained sobering. Total removal numbers since organized efforts began add up to somewhere around 20,000 snakes, a number that sounds impressive until you set it against population estimates that dwarf it by a factor of 10 or more. Researchers who once hoped for eradication have, publicly and painfully, shifted their language toward control and suppression. The honest truth is that Burmese pythons are almost certainly a permanent resident of South Florida now. The question was never going to be whether they could be erased. It was whether the damage they were causing could be slowed, or whether native wildlife would simply keep disappearing until there was nothing left to lose. As if an apex predator wasn't enough, the pythons brought something else with them that most people have never heard of, a parasite. Scientifically known as Raleigh orientalis and commonly called the snake lungworm, this organism hitched a ride from Southeast Asia inside the invading pythons and has since jumped into Florida's native snake species. The infection cycle is grim. Python waste carries the parasite's eggs into the environment, where they're picked up by insects like cockroaches. Small reptiles and amphibians eat the infected insects, and native snakes that prey on those smaller animals swallow the parasite along with their meal. Once inside a native snake, the larvae migrate into the lungs, where they mature and multiply, causing respiratory damage, lesions, and in severe cases, death by suffocation or starvation as the infected snake becomes too weak to hunt. What makes this especially troubling is the scope. Researchers have documented infections in more than a dozen native snake species, and the geographic spread of the parasite now extends well beyond the python's own range, moving independently through native snake populations as far north as parts of central and even northern Florida. It is a sobering reminder that invasive species rarely travel alone. They often bring hidden passengers whose damage can outlast and outpace the original invader. Against this backdrop of parasites, apex predators, and years of grinding, expensive, only partially effective control efforts, Florida wildlife officials made an announcement that seemed, to most people encountering it for the first time, almost like satire. The state was releasing large numbers of another snake species, the eastern indigo snake, into the wild specifically because it preys on other snakes, including, when the opportunity arises, young pythons. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Social media exploded with disbelief. Why would a state already drowning in snakes release more snakes? Comparisons were drawn to infamous historical blunders, like the introduction of mongooses to Pacific Islands to control rats, an effort that famously backfired when the diurnal mongoose and nocturnal rats rarely crossed paths, while the mongoose instead decimated native bird populations that had no defenses against a new mammalian predator. To a public exhausted by years of python headlines, this looked like one more example of good intentions paving the road to disaster. What almost none of the critics realized was that this was not a new or hastily conceived idea. It was, in fact, the culmination of decades of careful, patient conservation science, a program that had been quietly building for years before it ever generated a single viral headline. To understand why scientists were confident in this approach, you have to understand the animal itself. The eastern indigo snake is, by almost any measure, one of the most impressive reptiles native to North America. Adults can stretch past 8 feet in length, making them the longest native snake species on the continent. Their scales carry a deep, iridescent blue-black sheen that seems to shift color in the light, and many individuals display a warm rust or coral coloring along the throat and chin that makes them instantly recognizable. Unlike venomous snakes that rely on chemical weapons to subdue prey, the indigo is entirely non-venomous. It doesn't need venom. It relies instead on raw physical dominance, speed, and a diet broad enough to include almost anything it can overpower: rodents, birds, frogs, turtle eggs, and, notably, other snakes, venomous or not. Indigo snakes have a documented, almost casual immunity to the venom of native pit vipers like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, allowing them to hunt and consume venomous snakes that would kill most other predators. They don't constrict their prey the way many large snakes do. They simply overpower it and swallow it whole, alive if necessary, seemingly unbothered by resistance. Historically, this animal ranged across an enormous swath of the southeastern United States, from the coastal plains of Florida up through Georgia, the Carolinas, and portions of Mississippi and Alabama, occupying an estimated range of tens of millions of acres of longleaf pine forest and sandy scrub habitat. It functioned as one of the top reptilian predators across that entire region for longer than recorded history. The indigo's decline had nothing to do with pythons and everything to do with older, more familiar human pressures. Longleaf pine forest, the indigo's preferred habitat, has been reduced by roughly 95% or more from its historical range, cleared for agriculture, logging, and development over the course of the 20th century. What forest remained was often fragmented into small, disconnected patches too small to support healthy, breeding populations. Compounding the habitat loss was the indigo's close relationship with another declining species, the gopher tortoise. Indigo snakes rely heavily on the burrows dug by gopher tortoises for shelter, especially during cold weather, using these underground refuges to stay warm and safe from predators. As gopher tortoise populations declined due to habitat loss and, historically, hunting for food during lean economic times, the burrows the indigos depended on disappeared right along with them. In some regions, indigo populations were also directly targeted by rattlesnake hunters, who would pump gasoline fumes into tortoise burrows to flush out rattlesnakes for so-called roundup events, killing any indigo snakes sheltering in the same burrow as an unintended casualty. By the late 1970s, the decline was severe enough that the eastern indigo snake was formally listed as a threatened species under federal law. Estimates at the low point suggested that fewer than a few dozen genetically distinct breeding populations remained anywhere in its historical range. An animal that had ruled southeastern forests for longer than humans had lived on the continent had been reduced to scattered, fragile remnants, largely confined to pockets of Florida and southern Georgia. Long before the python crisis made headlines, conservation groups had already begun working to bring the indigo back. Captive breeding programs were established, carefully managing genetics to avoid the pitfalls of inbreeding in small founder populations. Land trusts and government agencies worked to restore longleaf pine habitat, using controlled burns to recreate the open, fire-adapted landscape the species depends on. Partnerships focused on restoring gopher tortoise populations as well, recognizing that you cannot bring back the indigo without also bringing back the burrows it needs to survive. Reintroduction efforts began cautiously, releasing captive-bred juveniles into carefully selected, restored habitat and then monitoring them using radio transmitters and regular field surveys to track survival, movement, and, eventually, breeding behavior. Early results were encouraging but fragile. Individual snakes surviving for a season, moving through restored habitat, occasionally being recaptured and measured by field teams checking on their progress. The moment the entire program had been waiting for arrived in the fall of 2023, when field cameras at a protected preserve in the Florida Panhandle captured something that had not been documented in the region in nearly 50 years: wild-born indigo snake hatchlings. These were not captive-bred snakes released as adults. These were the offspring of previously released snakes, born in the wild, to parents that had established themselves successfully enough to reproduce naturally. For a conservation program built on decades of patient, unglamorous work, it was the clearest possible signal of success. The population was not just surviving. It was reproducing on its own. In the years since, monitoring teams have documented growing numbers of both original release animals and their wild-born descendants moving through restored habitat across multiple counties, with similar reintroduction efforts now underway in neighboring states as well, expanding the program's footprint well beyond its original release sites. Perhaps the most striking part of this story is that the indigo snake program is not the only sign that Florida's native wildlife is beginning to push back against the python invasion, even without human help. Field researchers monitoring radio-tagged pythons have documented several extraordinary encounters in recent years, cases where native predators, animals that would have seemed hopelessly outmatched against a fully grown python, have managed to kill and even consume these massive invasive snakes. In one widely reported case, a tracked male python was found dead, apparently killed by a bobcat less than a tenth its size, a discovery that stunned researchers who had never documented anything like it before. Trail cameras elsewhere have captured alligators preying on smaller pythons, and even the endangered Florida panther, one of the rarest large mammals in North America, has been documented targeting invasive snakes on at least one occasion. None of these events suggest that native predators are suddenly capable of controlling the python population on their own. A handful of isolated kills does not undo 2 decades of ecological damage. But they do suggest something meaningful, that the ecosystem is not simply a passive victim. Given enough time, and enough support through restoration efforts like the indigo reintroduction, at least some native species appear to be adapting, learning, and beginning to reassert themselves in a landscape that had, for years, seemed entirely dominated by the invader. Looking back at the wave of ridicule that greeted the initial announcement, it's worth sitting with the irony. The public was quick to cheer on python bounty hunters as folk heroes, chasing invasive snakes through the mud for cash prizes and headlines, while simultaneously mocking scientists for pursuing a slower, quieter, and ultimately more sustainable solution using a native predator that belonged in that ecosystem in the first place. Both approaches were aimed at the same underlying goal, restoring some semblance of balance to a landscape pushed dangerously out of equilibrium. One simply made for better viral content than the other. The lesson embedded in this entire saga is one that ecologists have understood for a long time, even if the broader public sometimes needs a viral news cycle to relearn it. Complex ecological damage rarely has a single, simple fix. There was never going to be one tool, one hunting competition, one piece of technology, or even one predator species that would single-handedly solve a crisis decades in the making. What actually works, slowly and unglamorously, is rebuilding an ecosystem piece by piece, restoring the pieces that were lost, and trusting that a system given the right components will begin, however gradually, to heal itself. None of this amounts to a tidy, victorious ending. The Everglades python population remains enormous, almost certainly too large and too deeply established to ever be fully eliminated. The lungworm parasite the pythons carried with them continues to spread through native snake populations independent of its original host, a problem with no clear solution on the horizon. But for an ecosystem that many had quietly written off as a lost cause, for a native predator that had been reduced to a handful of scattered populations, and for a plan that the internet spent an afternoon mocking as one of Florida's dumbest ideas yet, the emerging picture is something rarer and more encouraging than most people expected. It is proof that even in a landscape overrun by an invader nobody could stop, restoring what belonged there in the first place might just be the quiet, unglamorous key to tipping the balance back. Whether the emperor of the forest can ever fully reclaim its old kingdom remains an open question. But for the first time in a very long time, in the shadowed sawgrass and pine flatwoods of Florida, it is, once again, in the fight.